Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today with our digital lecture series for the Sparks Heritage Museum in Sparks, Nevada. My name is Christine Johnson, and I'm the Executive Director and happy to welcome you here today. Today's lecture is with my good friend and colleague, Mr. Jack Hursh. Jack is formerly with the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names, served as a longtime board member and as the chair, and is certainly an expert in the field that he'll be speaking about today. In conjunction with that, this lecture serves as a complimentary lecture to the exhibit that's currently on at the Sparks Heritage Museum through June 19th. And this is on the State Board on Geographic Names and some of the histories of some of the really amazing place names we have on our landscape. So without further ado, I turn this over to you, Jack Hursh.
Well, thank you. And I want to pay special thanks to the Sparks Heritage Museum for having me here today for this presentation. And I also want to go on and thank the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology and all the geologists that I've worked with over the years, and in particular, Joe Tingley and Susan Tingley, who contributed greatly to the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names. And so here we go. This is just a story about my collection of photos and being involved with the Nevada landscape over my lifetime, really. And it's just a guy with a camera out there hiking around and appreciating the landscape. And I've had that privilege for working with the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology and being on the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names for a number of years, and being involved with actually naming some of these places in the beautiful state of Nevada. So whimsical names and uplifting places. And here in the foreground, we have the Mopung Hills. And this is a name that's derived from the Native American name. It's Paiute, and the translation of Mopung is mosquitoes. And so we have the Mosquito Hills, if you will. And this far distant silhouette mountain is the Trinity Range. And the Trinity name, we can take it two ways. It has that biblical reference, of course, and then Trinity also is a reference to just the description of the mountain. The mountain has three distinct high places, and so therefore is called the Trinity Range for that reason also. And so what we're going to talk about today here are the origins of names, and I'm just going to breeze through all 17 counties. There are about 250,000 place names in the state of Nevada, and I can only touch on a very few of those here. And so we will move right along here. And Nevada is Spanish, and in Spanish that means snow-covered. So here we have a name that is derived from the early Spaniards that came into our area. And the Sonoma Range, this photograph, wintertime, obviously, Humboldt County. Sonoma is a Native American name, and the meaning has a few different translations, and it's kind of hard in research to narrow down what the meaning was at the particular time that the name was derived. But in translation, it means prominent nose, which could refer to the tall, sharp peaks in this mountain. Or it also means earth village or valley of the moon. And so some of the geology might remind earlier settlers of the surface of the moon, who knows? Or maybe there was a large moonrise when somebody was going by. And that is just how whimsical some of the names are in the state of Nevada. In Humboldt County, the Sonoma is a Native American meaning prominent nose or earth village or valley of the moon. And you see these different meanings of a name. And so there is a lot of interpretation that can happen with a name, a lot of different interpretations, and it gets complicated, but we try our best. And so just a quick review of when Nevada became a state. 1864, we're battle-born. Abraham Lincoln sought re-election. New state with popular and electoral votes would give Lincoln support for his Reconstruction policies for the South, including the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So many Nevada place names have a connection to the Civil War, and we're going to see that later, but both the Confederate side and the Union side. So Nevada, considered second most mountainous state in the U.S., only behind Alaska. Alvin Mclean recognized 314 mountain ranges in Nevada in his publication, Silent Cordilleras, The Mountain Ranges of Nevada. We will talk about Alvin again later on in this slideshow. Alaska is the only state more mountainous, as I mentioned. We are also the third most seismically active state behind Alaska and California. So our very rugged topography, basin and range, it's shaped by a lot of seismic activity, small earthquakes. Hopefully we don't have too many big ones, but once in a while we do have big ones. And so very rugged landscape. And we're going to start with the counties. So Churchill County. Churchill is a name from commemorating General Sylvester Churchill, 1847, gallant conduct in the Battle of Buena Vista, Mexico. And so now we're just going to kind of do a photographic tour around Churchill County and Dixie Valley. Here's a Civil War name. It's a name from the Confederate sympathizers. The West Humboldt Range, the Pleistocene Lake Lahontan shoreline terraces. And if you look off to my right shoulder, you'll see different elevations or terraces. Those are erosional shorelines that Pleistocene Lake Lahontan formed. And it has receded since and is almost gone. But just roughly 10,000 years ago, there was a huge lake in northwestern Nevada. Here's the West Humboldt Range, Churchill County. And that goes back, this photograph harkens back to that definition of Nevada's name, snow covered. We often see a lot of snow covering Nevada. So, Buffalo Canyon in the Desatoya Mountains, Churchill County. The sedimentary layers of diatomite from an ancient lake are Shoshone is a name, the name Dessa is Shoshone, and it could mean cold or big black. And Toya means mountains. So we have Big Black Mountain as a rough interpretation of the name Desatoya. And here's a shot of the Desatoya. I'm standing in the Desatoya Mountains looking out. I'm looking over Smith Creek Valley, looking at the Shoshone Mountains. And then in the distance is Bunker Hill in the Toyabe Range. And so we're looking over Churchill and Lander counties in this photograph. And the bighorn sheep, it's the state mammal. If you're lucky enough to see one when you're up in higher elevations, it's certainly a treat. And here's the Stillwater Range. I'm actually standing in the Stillwater Range, and we're looking out over Dixie Valley, and in the distance is Fairview Peak. I very much enjoy viewing and just appreciating native plants of Nevada. And we've had a lot of invasive plants that have come into Nevada from other places over the years. And so it's a personal study of mine, looking at native plants. And here we have Prince's Plume in Churchill County. And here's a native tarantula in Churchill County. And we're going to talk about Mark Twain or Sam Clemens a little later as well. So this is a foreshadowing. But Mark Twain, when he was traveling across Nevada, he observed some of these tarantulas. And this guy was out there in Dixie Valley. But Mark Twain, in Roughing It, wrote about the tarantulas, and he called them starchy proud. Indeed, they would take up a straw and pick their teeth like a member of Congress. Here we go. Here's Wheat Peak, elevation 4,895 feet, and George Ridge in the Boone Jug Mountains. And so I'm going to walk you through this photograph. This is the newly named Wheat Peak, and then George Ridge coming down off of Wheat Peak. And this is a new name. It was instilled by the Nevada State Board and the U.S. Board on Geographic Names in 2018. And this is a fantastic example of how a name came to be. And this was literally a citizen of Carson City called me up or emailed me, and he had worked on some archaeological surveys back in the 1960s with Margaret Wheat, and I will talk a little bit about her. And he felt compelled to see if we would commemorate something for her. Well, I knew about Margaret Wheat. And so I was very open to that. So I filled out the paperwork and I put it on the agenda for the Nevada State Board. And then we deliberated over it. And so here is the book, Survival Arts of the Primitive Paiutes by Margaret Wheat. So Margaret Wheat was a very accomplished anthropologist, archaeologist in the state of Nevada. She had a hand in focusing attention on the Berlin ichthyosaur site, and she drew attention primarily from archaeologists from UC Berkeley at the time to come to the Berlin site and study the ichthyosaur fossils. And so Margaret Wheat just had her hand in a lot of important archaeological activities in the state of Nevada. And we're talking about the 1960s timeframe primarily here. And so Wuzzy George is the main person that was interviewed by Margaret Wheat in this book that Margaret Wheat published. And so on the cover here is Wuzzy George. And so this book is all about documenting the arts that the Paiutes used in their daily survival. And so here on the cover, Wuzzy is demonstrating harvesting of fibers from willows for the use in basket making. And then the photo to the right, she's demonstrating a winnowing basket used for cleaning pitch and needles from pine nuts before roasting. So it's an incredible process that actually our board went through, because we had deliberations of whether we should have should it be George Peak and Wheat Ridge. And so we had feedback from the Paiute tribe at Stillwater, and they actually gave us feedback saying that they would feel more honored if the ridge was named after Wuzzy George, because they felt the peak is held up by the ridge. And I remember that meeting so clearly, and it was almost a tearjerker moment. It was fascinating perspective. And so it was like, whoa. So in this case, a lot of us think peak is the highest honor, but it's not. In this case, the highest honor here is indeed for Wuzzy George, and the ridge named after her, holding up Wheat Peak. And so I'm almost a little teary-eyed. And so I'm very proud of this naming. I think it was really good. I think both of these people contributed a great deal to the culture of Nevada. And there's a lot of historical documentation here by Margaret Wheat and Wuzzy George. And so I'm very proud of this naming. And so comically also, the Wheat Peak and George Ridge are in the Boonjug Mountains. And so you ask yourself, where did that name come from? Well, it is a misnomer by Margaret Wheat's child, who upon seeing a June bug as they were doing these archaeological surveys in this area back in the 1960s, the child saw a June bug and proclaimed Boonjug. And it became a joke for a while amongst the community, but the name stuck, and it was proposed, and it became an official name in 1980. And it's kind of fun because we have a lot of very whimsical names in Nevada. And this is an example of how some of these whimsical names can come to fruition. And I like these whimsical names. They're a lot of fun. And so here's just a shot of Sand Mountain, the Stillwater Range on the left, the Sand Springs Range on the right, and then Fairview Peak, snow-covered way off in the distance. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of one of our other namings. And here's Sand Mountain. I climbed Sand Mountain with some friends. And Sand Mountain is not an easy thing to climb. It's like 2 steps up, 1 step back, because the sand is very soft. It's quite a workout, a lot of fun. And then we were jumping off the top of Sand Mountain and just having a lot of fun with that. And over in the Sand Springs Range later that day, I happened to see this horned lizard sunning himself on a volcanic rock. And that brings us to Pony Bob Peak. And I need a drink of water, just a second. So here's another good example of how a naming came about. And we had another citizen who happened to also be from Carson City area, who randomly got a hold of me and said, Jack, what about Pony Bob Haslam? How about a commemoration for him? And I thought, that's a fantastic idea. And I knew all about Pony Bob Haslam. And Pony Bob was one of the Pony Express riders in Nevada. And the Pony Express only ran 16 months in 1860 and 1861. And it carried the U.S. mail all the way from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. And you can imagine how difficult it was traversing across the state of Nevada. Well, Pony Bob had some perilous rides where at the times there were conflicts between the natives and the settlers, the European settlers coming in. And so the Pony Express stations had been attacked in Nevada, and Pony Bob had to skirt around and volunteer to keep the mail going. And he had some of these amazing rides that were done. They were like 380 miles done in only 24 hours. And so he was deemed one of the most heroic Pony Express riders, period. And then when the inaugural address was brought west, Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, it was Pony Bob Haslam carrying it across Nevada. And he was actually attacked and wounded, and he kept going. He got it through, and it got through to Sacramento. And so this was a time period just before the telegraph. And so that was the means, the fast way of communication at that time. So we have a gentleman from Carson City just randomly gets a hold of me and says, "Hey, babe, how about Pony Bob?" And I said, we started looking, and the process is this. We started looking at different locations along the route, and the route is from Friday Station at South Lake Tahoe down to Genoa and on through Carson City out to Buckland Station by Fort Churchill, on out to the Carson Lake area south of Fallon, and then over to Sand Springs Station by Sand Mountain. And so Pony Bob, that was his territory. That's the area he made these heroic rides. And so I had discussions with the gentleman who was the proponent and said, how about we go out and look at that area where he actually made the heroic rides? And so and I knew about this peak here. This is a peak out just beyond Salt Wells, just near Sand Mountain. And I knew it was unnamed. And the proponent, he and I went and climbed it. And we thought, this is a great location for Pony Bob, because, and I'll show you in the following photos. But before I move on, I had the chance down in this lower right photo to meet Stephen Haslam Nielsen, and he's the guy in the hat, and he is the great nephew of Pony Bob Haslam. So that was an amazing thing for me to meet them. So now we climb Pony Bob Peak, and this is the view. That's Highway 50 down there, and that's the Huck Salt Flat area, and that's the Sand Springs Range in the distance. And so these are the views that you start to see. And Pony Bob would have ridden his horse right down past there, down below there. And there's Sand Mountain, and the Sand Springs Pony Express station is just off to the right at the base of Sand Mountain. And so Pony Bob was tearing along on his horse right down below there. And if we were there at the time, we'd see him riding by if we were here. So in the foreground, I see some volcanic rocks that are right there on Pony Bob Peak. And so there's just one of my whimsical shots, you might say, to close with Churchill County. And how comical is it wherever you go in Nevada that a sign has bullet holes shot through it? And so we have the fan on a windmill with the shotgun holes shot through the fan. And so now moving on to Pershing County. And I got to admit, I went a little nuts with Pershing County, and it just happened as I was composing this. There's just a lot of nice things to demonstrate that were in Pershing County. So General John Pershing, he led the American Expeditionary Forces to victory over Germany in World War I in 1917 and 18. And Pershing County, that area was originally Humboldt County, and then Humboldt County divided in 1919, and the southern half became Pershing. And so now we have Pershing County. Now Star Peak, elevation 9,819 feet in the Humboldt Range. This is a commemorative name, and this is funny. I love to say this, and I like to say it fast. For Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt. He was a geographer, and he was a very famous geographer in his day. And that name was given to this mountain, or the Humboldt Range was given by John C. Fremont in 1845 and 46 during Fremont's expeditions, exploration expeditions across Nevada. And it turns out that the publications of Baron Frederick Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt were very popular worldwide. And John C. Fremont was very much a big fan of, we'll just say, von Humboldt this time. And so von Humboldt's writings and teachings were very much on prominently in John C. Fremont's mind. And so when John was passing through Nevada, he decided to put the name Humboldt on this mountain. And so the Humboldt River also gets its name from von Humboldt, and so does Humboldt County. And here's one of our very most recent namings. And so this is Wolfram Peak, elevation 7,592 feet in the Eugene Mountains. Wolfram is another name for tungsten. It's a rare metal element symbolized by W, which means wolfram, on the periodic chart. It's known for hardness and high density and used in metal alloys. So tungsten was discovered in the Eugene Mountains circa 1916 and was mined there through the 1950s. And so as we look at this, we had a number of names that we deliberated over this peak, and we decided to commemorate literally the mining history. And this was an important mining history. It was during World War I and World War II. So this mining activity helped preserve the United States. And we felt that was very important. And so from this perspective, there are a couple of different high points in the Eugene Mountains. And the Wolfram Peak is only 50 feet higher than the high point over on the left. And so from this perspective, it's almost hard to see which is the higher point, but I put a little arrow there. And so it almost looks like it's a lower, but it's not. It's more distant, and it's just a little bit higher than the peak on the left side. But we have Wolfram Peak, and I kind of like you might say, the tongue-in-cheek meaning, because it's wolf, meaning go wolf pack, and ram for the state mammal, the bighorn sheep. And that's just my joke, but
that's a big stretch, Jack.
Yeah, but I like to joke about that. But it indeed commemorates the tungsten mines of the area. So here we have the Trinity Range in the foreground and the Humboldt Range in the background. And that's just a photo I took that I liked. I just like it. And so the Trinity Range, three-peak mountain range, it's most likely the mountain range got its name because of the three sort of dominant high areas in the range. But it's certainly nice to think that the name also harkens to the biblical reference. It's a nice thought as well. And so Lovelock, so L for Lovelock, if you look over there, mid photograph, there's a big L painted on the mountain on the West Humboldt Range, and that's a commemoration for George Lovelock. He was an early homesteader and storekeeper in the Lovelock area. And can anybody venture to guess why this mountain range is called Lone Mountain? You're right, because it just stands alone. It stands out there all by itself. We have several lone mountains in Nevada. There's quite a prominent lone mountain on Highway 50 on the way to Eureka, and then a very prominent lone mountain on the way to Tonopah as you're driving into Tonopah. And here's sort of a late light, sunset, backlight type of photograph. And I really enjoyed this photograph because I took it because I could see the Pleistocene Lake Lahontan shorelines. If you look at the mountain in the middle right of the photograph, and you'll see some highlighted, very horizontal lines. And so here's a shot for all of you friends of the Pleistocene people. You're going to love that. And so you can see those Lake Lahontan shorelines. And then up above, you see the silhouette of Ragged Top Mountain in the distance. And we're going to talk about Ragged Top in a minute. And Ragged Top is just a name that merely is a descriptor. It's a ragged topped mountain. And so we have Ragged Top. And this is what Ragged Top looks like on the very top. And that's pretty outstanding, isn't it? It's a very rugged, steep mountain, and but absolutely spectacular. And it is in the Trinity Range as well. And this is the view looking back out in the distance towards the West Humboldt, over the Humboldt Sink area, and over the Carson Sink in the distance, and then over to the Stillwater Range. So that is the view from Ragged Top Mountain. And there's a shot I captured of an antelope near Ragged Top. And Toulon Peak in the Trinity Range as well. And Toulon is thought to be a commemorative name for the Mediterranean seaport in southern France. Well, nearby this site is the Toulon Railroad Station and Toulon Lake, and also that mill, that big mill that you see that's sort of in ruins when you're heading to Lovelock on I-80 off to the right. That's called the Toulon Mill and the Toulon Lake. And they built the mill because there was a source of water, and not a lot of water, but there was water, and you need some water to do some milling. And I think it's kind of comical that I don't know who did it, but at the time they must have, maybe they were from France, who knows? They had, for some reason, the port city of Toulon, France in their mind, and decided to name this port site along Toulon Lake in Nevada Toulon, after the Toulon port city of France. And here's a shot of Lovelock Cave in the West Humboldt Range. And this is just a nice Nevada filler I like to put in here. It's certainly symbolic of Pershing County and much of the cow counties of Nevada. And you can see, I think it's comical. The foreground, the cows are grazing. They're very calm. They're unaware of anything going on. And in the middle ground, there's the cowboy roping the calf, and the dog helping herd the calf. And there's a calf on the left saying, "I'm getting out of here," and in a full gallop. And so we have a lot of action, sort of a contrast of action in this photograph. So here's a shot of the Sawavi Mountains. And I just like this. The Sawavi name is just a interpretation from Northern Paiute, and it just merely means sage. So it's a reference to our state flower, the sagebrush. And Seven Troughs Range in the foreground here, and the Trinity in the Humboldt Range, Humboldt being the snow-covered range. And this is might say a commemorative photo to our agricultural industry and the sheep industry, because we have a sheep herder here on this foreground hill with his staff, and off to the left in the foreground, you'll see a number of sheep grazing.
Jack, maybe use your mouse and point out.
Oh, I forgot about the mouse. I'm not used to using that mouse. So here's the sheep herder with the staff, and then the sheep down here grazing. And so in rural Nevada, there are still is still a lot of active grazing on the land with sheep and cattle. And here's high in the Seven Troughs Range. And one of the reasons I put this photo in here, it's a foreshadowing, because I want you to look off in the distance, the upper left, where I'm going to arrow, because I remember the arrow. So this is King Lear Peak. We're going to talk about King Lear Peak briefly, but King Lear is one of those fun names in Nevada that hearken to popular literature, and we will talk more about that later. And this is my geologic hazards slide in this slideshow. And this is Tunnel Camp in the Seven Troughs Range, and you'll see there's a cemetery here. But off to the right in another canyon, there was a turn-of-the-century mining camp called Mazuma. And then further up that canyon was the mining camp of Seven Troughs. And what's actually common in Nevada, you can have isolated thunderstorms that will just come up rapidly in the summer. And what happened in 1912, a thunderstorm that the thunderheads rolled into the upper elevations of Seven Troughs Range, cast down a bunch of rain. The canyons captured that falling rain, and a flash flood occurred, and it came cascading down the canyon where Seven Troughs Mining Camp and Mazuma Mining Camp were located. Fortunately, the structures, the buildings at Seven Troughs mostly were built up higher on the canyons. So and the flash flood had not built enough momentum at that point because it's higher up in the canyon. However, they had built a lot of the structures in Mizuma, which is at the base of the canyon, right down in the canyon. And it was at the base of the canyon. And so this tremendous force of the flash flood, by the time it got all the way down the canyon and hit Mizuma, it almost completely destroyed the entire little town. And 8 people were killed on July 11th, 1912. And so for anybody, recreation in Nevada, don't camp right at the base of a canyon, number one. And then maybe if you're going to build your house, it's not such a good idea to build a house right at the base of a canyon. But you never know when a flash flood might occur. And it's also interesting to know Nevada is very active in earthquakes. We have many, many earthquakes, but there have actually been more people killed in Nevada by flash floods than by earthquakes. And that's just an interesting, fun fact. So, okay, we talked about Alvin Mclean briefly before. And Alvin, this is perhaps the most proud recent naming, I feel. Alvin was a major rock star in this state. He was an outdoorsman, an archaeologist, a geographer, a geologist, a historian. Alvin was passionate about rock shelters, caves, hoodoos, petroglyphs. He was the state's foremost expert on petroglyphs and documenting petroglyphs, and he documented many of these special features. He was involved in archaeological surveys across the state, and a coworker of mine one day just sort of casually said, we should commemorate something for Alvin Mclean. And I went, oh, that's a brilliant idea. And one of the stipulations is an individual has to have passed away at least 5 years before a name can be commemorated for them. And indeed, Alvin had already passed away, and so he was eligible. And many of you will recognize Alvin Mclean for several years was the host on KNPB's Channel 5 Wild Nevada. And so many of us in just that are passionate about Nevada had met Alvin. Who didn't? Everybody knew Alvin. And so it was just natural to commemorate something for Alvin. So our board, the Nevada State Board, did a lot of studying. We found different areas across the state. And because Alvin was into arches and hoodoos, we considered some arches that were unnamed. We considered some hoodoos. We considered some petroglyph sites. Petroglyph sites actually are not eligible for our board to name. So we moved on and we decided, it has to be a geologic feature. And so we started looking at mountain peaks. And I actually had many conversations with Alvin, just casually in the hallway type of thing. I knew that Alvin was particularly passionate. I mean, he was passionate about the whole state. There's no doubt. He was particularly passionate about the Winnemucca Lake area. And I had many discussions about petroglyphs and different things about the Winnemucca Lake area with Alvin. So I had it in my mind that maybe this was a good place to look. And so I went out there and literally explored around Winnemucca Lake. And I noticed this peak, and I'll if you haven't figured it out, this is Mclean Peak. So that was an unnamed peak. I discovered this peak was unnamed. It is not the high point in the Nightingale Mountains. The high point is further south, and the high point is a rather large arcing ridge. It doesn't come to a great prominence, if you will. And so it's not quite as striking. And I also knew that Alvin had done a lot of archaeological surveys in this area. And so I had a feeling that this might be a very appropriate location. And so I actually got a hold of Alvin's brother, and I had a discussion with him and told him about this site. And Alvin's brother, who had accompanied Alvin many times on archaeological surveys, gave me a grand blessing for this site. He said that would be very good, and that he felt Alvin would be proud. And so I proposed this, and so we went through the process. And in 2016, this mountain peak was named Mclean Peak after Alvin Mclean. And so just a little more about Alvin. Alvin did write the book Silent Cordilleras, the mountain ranges of Nevada. It is Nevada's Bible for mountain ranges. He was cutting edge in documenting the mountain ranges and defining the mountain ranges of Nevada. And this publication is actually quite rare to find. It has been out of print for many years, but it's just one of the best. And he wrote transcripts on archaeological surveys, and he wrote the book Pyramid Lake, and different books and articles, and you name it. And so Alvin, like I said, was a rock star. And so we climbed Mclean Peak, and you can see Winnemucca Lake below. And I'm standing here taking this photograph, and my friend Cheryl went over, and this is a very steep, very precipitous mountain. It's actually quite dangerous because a lot of the rocks are loose, and it's very steep, and these canyons just go straight down hundreds of feet. And Cheryl made her way, and she made her way up, and I'll use the arrow again. There is Cheryl on top of Mclean Peak. And I told her, I said, you got to go over there because I need to get a picture of you over there. And this was amazing for me in my lifetime to have known a person and then see it followed through and then actually go there. And it just all seemed right. It was a good thing, I think. And so very proud of Mclean Peak. And so moving on, Nevada Yin and Yang, and that's just me joking. That's not an official name. That's me joking. Official names would be Phlox and Cowplop in Pershing County, and so I just like to call it Nevada Yin and Yang. Ha ha. And the Selenite Range, and that's a name hearkening to the mineral selenite that is found in that range. And then back to native plants. I love native plants and hoary balsam root and the Blackrock Desert, and we can see why the Blackrock Desert gets its name. It's from that big volcanic formation that is very black, hence the Blackrock Desert. And that's my little dune buggy out there for a commemorative ride on the land speed record area. And my dune buggy will only go about 40 miles an hour, but at 40 miles an hour, that little Volkswagen feels like you're going 700 miles an hour. So it all works, and that's the Blackrock Desert. So another shot of the Blackrock Desert and the Selenite Range in the distance, and a great illustration of the Pleistocene Lake Lahontan shoreline terraces in the foreground. And then this is, that little arrow is elusive for me, but so these are those Pleistocene Lake Lahontan shoreline terraces. So that ancient lake sat there for years and years in wave action, and then it would recede and maybe rise again, recede down, and it carved these shoreline beach terraces. And so if that should be clear. And so Dry Lake, this is a kind of a funny one for me too. The official name is actually Dry Lake. And in Nevada, we have seasonal dry lakes all over Nevada. And a lot of them have official names. We have White Lake, Silver Lake, Snowwater Lake, Winnemucca Lake, you name it. I could go on and on where we have this official name followed by lake, like Winnemucca Lake. This lake is actually called Dry Lake.
We have a chat question asking if we know the origin of Lake Lahontan's name.
Baron Lahontan was a French surveyor, explorer. So he was another explorer like John C. Fremont. And we're talking about Oh,
We have somebody weighing in the chat too that says
oh, okay, go for it.
The name Lahontan is a mystery, and the Great Basin is that portion of Western North America that has no drainage to the sea. The name Lahontan was given to the ancient lake by Clarence King while exploring a route for the Transcontinental Railroad. So thank you.
Okay, so it was a similar, it's a parallel type of thing going on. So King, doing his surveys, was probably a subscriber to maybe the writings or the explorations of the gentleman by a French explorer by the name of Lahontan, and so that name is their commemoration of a French explorer by the name of Lahontan.
Well, thank you for letting us interrupt you. Continue.
Yeah. And okay, so here we have just a very simple commemoration, just an early settler by the name of Hiram Kane, and the mountain has taken his name over the years. And then Augusta is a nearby early mining district, and Augusta is a Latin meaning great or magnificent. And I like those names like Eureka and Augusta and Fandango and that type of thing. And so the Tobin Range, so nearby Tobin mining camp, presumably named for the Clement L. Tobin family of Winnemucca. And here's the fault scarp. So I'm glad you pointed out the arrow, Christine, because I actually never knew before, but follow the arrow because this is a great geology and also geologic hazards photograph. And the arrow, see the base of the Tobin Range, and going along that base right there is a very large earthquake fault scarp. And it's from the 1915 Pleasant Valley 7.3 magnitude earthquake. So that was one of our big ones in 1915. And that fault scarp is still visible. It did damage. This is quite a ways from Winnemucca and Lovelock, but there were structures that were completely, suffered great damage due to this earthquake. This earthquake was felt in Fallon, and it's even thought to have been felt in much greater distances than even Fallon. And so a biggie, and we can still see the remnants of this earthquake with that fault scarp from the 1915 7.3. Washoe County. Washoe is a native language, the Washoe tribe. There's a name there that almost sounds like Washoe, and it means people from here. So it is a Washoe tribe name meaning people from here. And here we have Slide Mountain, and Slide Mountain is a descriptor of the geology in action, where the soil will become too saturated from some rain and snow events, and the soil does not have enough energy to hold itself together, and it will lose that cohesion, and it will go cascading down the mountain, and it has caused another series of great geologic hazards, you might say, that are very visible there. If you turn off at Davis Creek Park and go to Bowers Mansion, you travel through an area with great debris from landslides that have come off of Slide Mountain. And so that's how Slide Mountain got its name. And I could not give a slideshow without showing some barns because I love historic barns. And so I also like the fact that I can get a barn and Slide Mountain in one shot. And so here's Slide Mountain with the Jones Ranch barn. And Valley Road barn, this barn is no longer, but it used to be over there on the east side of University of Nevada's campus on Valley Road. And what's fun about Valley Road is Valley Road actually was called Surprise Valley Road initially because there were stagecoach lines that ran from Reno all the way up to Surprise Valley in Modoc County, California. And the name was shortened in more modern times. I don't know exactly when, but Surprise Valley Road was shortened down to Valley Road. And I could not go anywhere without talking about the little buildings at Bartley Ranch Park, and we call them Truckee Meadows Remembered. And this is Bartley Ranch Park Regional Park, and they name Bartley, interestingly enough, was originally Biscaglia. The Biscaglia family changed their name to Bartley on purpose in around 1930s to sound more American. They were Italian immigrants, old family, but they wanted to sound more American, and they changed their name from Biscaglia to Bartley. And so there's a morph of, you might say, the mature or the changing of a name to fit in, I guess. So Reno, Fuller's Crossing Bridge, 1859, Lakes Crossing in 1863, and then it was called Reno in 1868 after Jesse Lee Reno, who was a Civil War Army officer. So another Civil War name, Reno. Reno, going back, one of the proposed names was Argenta, which means silver. It's Latin for silver. That was an early proposed name for Reno. So we almost lived in Argenta, Nevada. This is Tahoe Meadows, and this is an interesting name in the media. They will often refer to the Tahoe Meadows as Sheep Flat, and I was like, what? And the official name is Tahoe Meadows. But for some reason on radio and television in our local media, they will refer to it as Sheep Flat. So we did a little research, and sure enough, there are some early articles that refer to this as Sheep Flat. So it's a variant name, you might say. And so a variant name is another name that sort of gets listed along with the official name as an occurrence of usage. And so, but it indeed, the official name is Tahoe Meadows. And most of the snowshoeing and cross-country skiing people I know will just automatically say, hey, I'm going up to Tahoe Meadows today, but you never know. So Lake Tahoe, it's a native name for big water or high water. Fremont, that was a name by Fremont. Or Lake Bonpland was a name given by Fremont in 1843 and 45. And again, Bonpland was one of those characters in history that Fremont was studying and knew. And so Lake Bigler became a name in 1852, and then became the official name Lake Tahoe in 1862, which is the Washoe tribe name, meaning big water or high water. And so Sam Clements Cove. Christine, do you want to talk about Sam Clements Cove?
The cove that never was?
Yeah.
Well, some of you actually might have heard of the controversy over Clements Cove. We had what is it, more than 10 years ago now, an effort to name Clements Cove up in Lake Tahoe on the Nevada side. And early on, there was some controversy, some thoughts by people, including people in other states, that thought maybe, that shouldn't be named. And the reality, as you mentioned early on, Jack, is that noteworthy people like presidents or international or nationally recognized notable people are qualified to have any site named for them based on that a national criteria, let's just say. And Sam Clemens, alter ego, other personality pen name of Mark Twain, certainly would qualify as one of those people. And Clemens did spend a lot of time here in Nevada, and early on there was an effort to name Clements Cove. Well, circumstances prevented that from happening, and then it was revisited 5 or 6 years later. And,
right.
Yeah. And again, more circumstances, a lot of discussion. And quite honestly, this is why in the exhibit, and I hope you do all come to visit the exhibit at the museum, this particular image, is this the right image? Is this the image that you have in the exhibit?
It is, yeah.
Beautiful. This is shown in our controversial names section of the exhibit, because it is kind of noteworthy here to include this still unnamed cove in the section of controversy with regard to perspective. And the last time it was put forward, there was feedback from the Washoe tribe that they didn't support naming Clemens, naming the cove or any site for Clemens, given that the terminology that he used in his books during that era has come to be considered derogatory in nature with regard to how he referred to the Native Americans. So with that in mind, of course, the board considers and welcomes and actually needs the input of our tribes. And we have 27 federally recognized tribes in the state that we endeavor to work with constantly. And so when we got that feedback, there really was nowhere to turn at that point without disregarding the Native perspective. And so today that cove remains unnamed, but there are many things named for Sam Clemens or Mark Twain, both in our state and throughout the country. So it's an interesting thing to think about, and certainly touches on the idea of controversy and some of the things that we deal with as name boards across the country. Almost every state has an active names board that functions as an advisory panel to the United States board. And we work as closely as we can to offer up representation of the agencies that sit on the board, in addition to representing the people in the state that have the opportunity to come forward at any public meeting and share their thoughts with us. The process takes over a year, generally, for any of these names. And Sam Clemens Cove, I don't know, Jack, what would you say? I would
something
I would say that they dealt with that. That was actually before my time on the board. Might have been actually before your time originally, but it went on for over I would say six plus years as far as an active effort, and then kind of lives today in purgatory as far as me. So it's an interesting story, and certainly an example of the social climate of today and how we're working to include all perspectives of people in the dialogue.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. That very well said. And of course, I saw Sam Clemens up there, and I happened to get a photograph.
Now, wait a minute. We have to think about
this.
There.
That was, but that's indeed McAvoy Lane impersonating Sam Clemens. But Sam Clemens, the real one, was there in 1861. So rabbit brush, more native plants, and the Pleistocene Lake Lahontan sediments off there in the upper right. And so the Truckee River, so called the Salmon Trout River by John C. Fremont in 1844, and later in 44 named Truckee by perhaps the Stevens Murphy Immigrant Party, they encountered a native Paiute gentleman who exclaimed, "To gut you." It sounded like Truckee. They thought he was greeting them with his name, but it is more likely he was saying, "To get you," which in Paiute is for all right or very well. And so here's a shot of the Pyramid Lake from the Paw-Raw Range, and Paw-Raw, it might mean Shoshone name for river. So here's a shot of Pyramid Lake from the Virginia Mountains, and you can see the pyramid off in the distance and the lake range in the distance. And here's a close-up of the pyramid at Pyramid Lake, and this area is now closed off. You can't go there anymore. And I took these photographs many years ago when it was still open. And Pyramid Lake was a name given by John C. Fremont in 1844 when he passed right by here and camped right here at the pyramid. And there's a nice silhouette with the sun setting over the pyramid, which is a tufa formation. And a tufa is calcium carbonate bubbling up from hot springs and depositing calcium carbonate deposits and creating a formation. And this is a very large tufa formation. So Deep Hole Ranch, Smoke Creek Desert. And we're just kind of doing a tour here of Washoe County. And a close-up of Pogonip. And that's a Shoshone Paiute name, which means white death. But it's frost. It's Jack Frost. And then our area sometimes can be pretty dramatic, and it is called Pogonip. Here's a shot of Duck Flat in northern Washoe County. And I like this shot because it illustrates several native bushes, including Indian rice grass, which is the state grass of Nevada. And there's sagebrush and rabbit brush and white top, and not white top, but we'll move on. Several brushes. So Limbo Peak, Purgatory Peak, and Kumava Peak. Kumava is in the distance, higher peak, and it could mean in the clouds. And in fact, Kumava is in a little bit of cloud shadow in this photograph. And I'm standing in the lake range with Winnemucca Lake in the middle ground. And a volcanic dike in the lake range, Winnemucca Lake in the middle, and the Nightingale Mountains in the distance. And the Nightingale Mountains in the distance. And Nightingale was a sheriff or treasurer of Humboldt County in 1861, 1862. And Winnemucca is a Paiute name which could mean one shoe. And there's some stories and legends about a man that went on a big hike and he came back with only one shoe, and so his nickname was Winnemucca. There's some kind of legend like that. And then the Nightingale Mountains and Winnemucca Lake again, and the lenticular wave clouds here. I've always loved this photograph, and then we have some small tufa formations in the foreground, and Black Warrior Peak in the upper right. And you can see some Lake LaHontan shorelines off in the distance there in this photograph as well. And this is way up in northern Washoe County, Massacre Ranch, and some outcroppings. And the white frost, you might say, on these rocks are actually rodent droppings. So this is home to some native rodents and marmots, and they come out and they survey their land, and they make their deposit on a rock, and that's what the white markings are. And so purple sage, that's kind of a romantic name in Western lore, and there indeed is purple sage. And this is the Granite Range, and it's so aptly named because of the granite rock in the range. And the clouds in this cast a shadow, which to me, if you look right here, is a rabbit running in full stride, running from right to left with his forelegs, with his front legs extended out. And here's the head and the ears of the rabbit. And the Trinity Ranch, and this is just a homestead site, northern Washoe County, whose name is taken from the early homesteader that settled there. Humboldt County. So we're back to von Humboldt again, the geographer, and he was one of the heroes of John C. Fremont. And High Rock Canyon, and this is one of the routes of the Immigrant Trail, coming across the Lassen Immigrant Trail. There were like 100,000 people on their wagons and teams of oxen and horses that came up through this canyon on their way to the gold rush of California. And here we have a Great Basin rattlesnake, and it's perhaps the friendlier end of the rattlesnake, and so I chose to photograph the Bilk Creek Mountains in northern Humboldt, the Hinky Summit, Santa Rosa Range, and some aspen, and a close-up of the aspen leaves, the quaking aspen in the Santa Rosa Range. And here's the Granite Peak, elevation 9,747 feet in the Santa Rosa Range, and it's named for the St. Rosa of Lima. Granite Peak is a popular name in Nevada. There are actually several granite peaks in Nevada. This is Blowout Mountain. This is a fun geology type of a photograph where you have a volcanic, almost like a caldera rising up, and it blew half that mountain right off in our direction in this perspective. And it indeed takes the name Blowout Mountain because of that volcanic activity. And a close-up of paintbrush, native plant. And so here I had a foreshadowing earlier of King Lear Peak. And so here I'm on top of King Lear Peak, elevation 8,842 feet in the Jackson Mountains. And we have several place names in Nevada that were taken by popular literature at the time. So we had immigrants coming into Nevada, settling in the late 1800s. And so there was popular literature at the time of the late 1800s, and in this particular case, King Lear, the Shakespeare. Railroad Point, and this is a volcanic lava flow. It's natural, but it has such a level surface that it reminded people of a railroad grade, and hence the name Railroad Point. And here are some you might say some non-native settlers at Railroad Point, some wild burros. And then here is a roundup that I was able to attend in the Montana Mountains, and that's the Santa Rosa Range out in the distance. And just a simple name given to a homestead location in Humboldt County. And it's just called Sod House because you have this old structure. It's a vernacular structure made of local volcanic rocks held together by mud. And then you have a roof with timbers with mud and then a sod grasses planted. And that's what a sod roof means. And it is called Sod House. And I was able to capture a bird flying through that window. If you didn't notice the bird, there's a bird right there flying through the window. And Story County, Edward Ferris Story, he was captain of the Company K of the Virginia Rifles Washoe Regiment, killed in the Battle of Pyramid Lake. So the Battle of Pyramid Lake in 1860, and we had a casualty. And so Story County is a commemorative name for Edward. And here's the consolidated mine head frame at Virginia City. And I like to feature this. This is an interior photograph of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Virginia City. And it's just you might say it's commemorating all of Virginia City and the amazing architecture that is the amazing historical architecture up there at Virginia City. And Sugarloaf, the feature just below Virginia City, name possibly given by a native of Rhode Island, and the location of Sugarloaf Hill is, and so named for the sugary cake with high rounded ends. How about that? And a native plant and a little butterfly that landed on this blazing star. And the arrow right there will show you the skipper. It's a native butterfly. And so Nye County, named after James Warren Nye, governor of Nevada Territory, 1861 to 1864. He was the secretary of the territory, or the secretary of the territory was Orion Clemens, the older brother of Samuel Clemens. Silvertop Shaft, Tonopah Historic Mining Park, and Tonopah is Shoshone or Paiute name meaning hidden spring or greasewood spring, or various derivations of that interpretation, but it basically means spring, or spring associated with a brush or a greasewood or a hidden spring, and that's where Tonopah gets its name. And the Shoshone Mountains, that's a commemoration for the Shoshone tribe. And this just happens, I have a little icon down there. That's the cover photo of the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology's book, Traveling America's Loneliest Road, a Geologic and Natural History Tour across Nevada by Joe Tingley and Chris Pizarro and company at the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology. And my photo, I'm lucky enough, is the cover photo of that book. And then the Shoshone Mountains, and again, we have hundreds down here in the foreground of sheep. If I can find the arrow, these are sheep grazing in the sagebrush, and right here is a sheep herder on horseback. And I just love photos like that. And here's a physical descriptor name, the Monitor. This is why Monitor Valley and the Monitor Range has its names. It's a volcanic lava flow shaped like the Civil War ironclad warship, the Monitor. And so using the arrow, this feature right here is a volcanic lava flow, just kind of sits out there all alone in the valley. And that profile actually resembles the Civil War ironclad warship, the Monitor, and that is where that name is derived. And so here's Diana's Punch Bowl, a name after the Roman mythical goddess of the hunt, the moon, and the birthing. And here is Bear Mountain in Nye County, and boy, is this geology galore, just beautiful. And it's named because of the bare naked appearance. I spoke not a lot of trees on this mountain to cover up that geology. And the sedimentary rock folded and thrusted and faulted like crazy on this mountain, with all the different colors, beautiful. And so James W. Nye, governor of Nevada Territory, appointed by Abraham Lincoln. And this is Arc Dome, elevation 11,775 feet in the Toyabe Range. And this is a very early sunrise, very early morning. And Toyabe is a form of the Shoshone word toyop, meaning mountain. And so we have a very big mountain. And of course, Arc Dome gets its name, just the physical description of that very large arc that the peak resembles. And up in the Arc Dome wilderness, we have some arbor glyphs. Early sheep herders taking their sheep up in the high country where there was ample grass and forage for the sheep. And the sheep herders it was like early graffiti, and they would scribe on the trees and sort of communicate, let's say, humor, and just to tell people they were there. And so Arc Dome Wilderness again in this shot. Moonrise over the Cowich Peak. And I like this name. It's a simple name, Shoshone chief, whose name was thought to mean mountain. And so literally, you interpret the name as meaning mountain peak. And so very simple name, simple interpretation, but I like it. It's pretty neat. So Cowich Peak and the Moonrise, of course. Christine, do you want to talk about pupfish?
Well, what's interesting about this particular one is it's one of the ones that I'll just talk about the board perspective on this, that we had controversy with regarding naming a high point for a living thing that lives so far away from the high point in a range. And should you name things above for things below? What came to pass is so powerful with regard to why this name matters on the land. Do you want to talk?
That's perfect, actually. And so this is one of our and I forgot to put the date, but it's 2019, isn't it? I believe.
And I think it was approved at the U.S. level in 2020.
Okay, so 2020, this is one of our very newest names in the state of Nevada. And so like Christine suggested there, we had to deliberate over the fact, do we name a peak after a little fish that lives down in a spring at the base of the mountain? But it was a very demonstrative name to honor a little fish and then honor and recognize how important it is for us to be good stewards of the land and to protect the fellow living beings on the state of on this earth. And so this was a very good naming. And so this peak now has the name Pupfish Peak in the Devil's Hole Hills, honoring that native fish, the Devil's Hole and Ash Meadows Armagosa pupfish. And this is very rare. It's an endangered fish. And so we are hoping that this can be a symbol for the protection of other wildlife, including wild plants, wild animals, and that we can all hopefully work together and make it all work.
It's important to add here, I think at the last count, the wildlife department had less than 150 of these fish left. And so with that being certainly on the endangered species list, I think it was added in the 1960s to the endangered species list. And it is in a protected area, and it's supposed to be a fenced off kind of restricted area to try and help protect this fish with so few left. Like you said, Jack, to name the peak for this very unique and kind of endemic species of fish to Nevada. It is a powerful and demonstrative name, as you mentioned.
I like it. Mineral County. So Mineral County just gets its name because of the highly mineralized area. And here's a little history: historic mining district, Aurora. And going back to Sam Clemens. Sam Clemens lived there, and so he got around. And Brawley Peaks. This was our board deliberated over the proposals by citizens in Mineral County to actually correct what they thought had been perpetuated misspellings of names. So there had been name spellings that had been on maps for many years, and there was research done that said, actually, we can prove that the name actually should have been this. It was the same name, but spelled slightly differently. And so you might say we had spelling corrections done, and we officially had it on the agenda and had the names officially changed in their spelling. And so that's what occurred here. And this is by Aurora, the mining camp of Aurora, and those peaks up above. Brawley Peaks. The spelling changed to what looks more like Braley Peaks. And that name change or spelling change was done by the Nevada and U.S. Board in 2015. And this is Gabs Valley Range. And I spotted that cowboy riding, and I pulled over and waved him over and had a conversation with him. And he lit up a cigarette, and I actually call this photo Smoking Roper, but it was Bill on his horse Dancer, and there was Bill. And it was just it was a cool moment, meeting this guy out on the range. And he was literally moving cattle out to another grazing area. So here's the Rhodes Salt Marsh in the Excelsior Mountains in Monroe County. And I love the dust devils that kick up. And the Brooken Hills mining district in Monroe County. And this was just one of my fun stories. It was a very hot day, 90 degrees. I climbed to the top of this hill, and here was this little fox just lying there. And he was panting, and he didn't run away. And I was able to just take a bunch of photos of him, and he just walked around and wasn't afraid of me. And it was an amazing moment because I'm not really a wildlife photographer. I don't usually carry big lenses and that type of thing, but this guy was so close to me, I was able to get these shots, and just a cool moment on a hot day. Lyon County commemorates Civil War General Nathaniel Lyon. The Carson River at fall time, as you can see, and Mount Davidson off there in the distance where Virginia City is located. And this is one of our namings, and it's Fremont Lookout, elevation 4,993 feet, and you can see the Pine Nut Mountains in the distance. This commemorates John C. Fremont's 1844 exploration through Nevada. And so in John C. Fremont kept records, he kept diaries, and he described as he was going along from day to day and where they would camp. And so a few days prior is when he was camping at Pyramid Lake, and where he gave the name Pyramid Lake to Pyramid Lake. And a few days later, he was down here, and this is by Fort Churchill area, by the Carson River. And he described climbing this hill and looking out, and he looked to the west, and he could see a snow-covered mountain range, and there was a lot of snow, and he was intimidated by going west because of that snow. And in his diary, he described also seeing the river, which is the Carson River, and he could see the cottonwood trees going off into the west. Well, that would be where Dayton is now. And that large mountain, snow-covered mountain range would be the Carson Range. And so he was trying to decide which direction should we go next. And it was at this point, he was also looking south. And from this vantage point, he could see Mason Valley, where Yarrington is located. And he could see the large cottonwood trees in Mason Valley. And so he realized, well, there must be water or a river down there in that valley as well. And there was not snow. The mountains down towards Mason Valley were not as big as the Carson Range, and so they did not have the snow. So he made the decision, hey, tomorrow let's start hiking to the south instead of the west. And that was spelled out in his diary. And so the Dayton Valley Historical Society wanted to commemorate something for John C. Fremont in their area. And this is the area this is the location that we all agreed upon would be maybe most suitable for this description. And so hence it was named Fremont Lookout in 2016 by the Nevada Board and the U.S. Board. Anything to add, Christine? Is that good?
No, not really. It's a beautiful site, and is that you in the picture there?
It is me. That's a cameo appearance by me, and I'm pretending to be John C. Fremont. There, looking out to the west.
That went into that site too.
What's that?
There was a lot of research that went into that site.
It was hard really to know exactly because his writings were somewhat vague. This was the site where we hiked around and hiked to different spots, and based on Fremont's writings, we decided this might be the most likely spot because it fit his observations the best. And so this is the commemorative. And in fact, this is the only site in Nevada that is named John C. Fremont. There is a pass in the Lake Range that is called, I think it's called Fremont Pass, and that is the only other name. But this is the only true naming in Nevada for John C. Fremont. There were a lot of names in Nevada that John C. Fremont gave to Nevada. So the Sweetwater Mountains. That's a big mountain range. Desert Creek area, and I had to sneak a barn in there. Wilson Canyon, Walker River, Pinyon Pine. So this is Nevada State Tree along with the bristlecone pine. Becker's white butterfly and rabbit brush. There are actually a lot of butterflies in Nevada, and that stems from the changes in elevation, the radical elevation changes we can have, the different changes in flora that can host different species, and so we indeed have quite a biodiversity, in fact. So Esmeralda County. Esmeralda is the name after the gypsy girl in Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame. So here we have a literary name. And Columbus Salt Marsh, the White Mountains snow-covered, and Boundary Peak, that tall peak over here. And it's the tallest peak in Nevada, and it's 13,140 feet, plus or minus a few feet. The different surveys tend to not completely agree, and they get more accurate as the new surveys come along. So Monte Cristo Range, this is also a popular literature name. The Count of Monte Cristo in 1844 by Alexander Dumas. So here we have a double whammy with the literary reference. And prickly pear cactus. The Silver Peak Range in Esmeralda County. Lander County, named after Frederick Lander, chief engineer for a federal wagon route, the Central Overland Route, served as Indian agent circa 1860 in Nevada. Died as brigadier general in the Civil War in 1862. And Battle Mountain, and some more sheep, and we have the black sheep there. And Bunker Hill. Here's one of our names commemorating a Revolutionary War name, the Battle of Bunker Hill, Revolutionary War, near Boston, Massachusetts. So Big Creek, Toyabe Range. Argenta Rim, Shoshone Range. Argenta, again, is that Latin name for silver. Smith Creek Valley, named for Captain James Simpson in 1859 for his assistant Lieutenant J.L. Kirby Smith. Simpson and a party of 64 men of the topographical engineers in 1859 surveyed a route from Camp Floyd south of Salt Lake City to Genoa, Nevada. This route helped establish the route of the Pony Express, the Overland Stage, the Overland Telegraph, the Lincoln Highway, and roughly the route of U.S. Highway 50. Nevada has several place names honoring Simpson as well. Eureka County. The expression Eureka means I have found it. Dates back to Archimedes, who was known to have yelled this when he discovered how to determine the purity of gold. And there's Eureka town. Here's the Monitor Range. We discussed earlier where that name came from. The Fish Creek Range, Pancake Range, and White Pine Range. Got to research where they got pancake. That's a fun one. It must have tasted good that morning. The Diamond Mountains, the Diamond Spring Station along the Pony Express. This was a Pony Express station. Vernacular shack, meaning just a neat old shack built from local timbers harvested off the mountain. Elko County, a railroad name found in several states in the United States. It's merely a Germanic boy name. So somebody, maybe a German settler in Elko County, just named it Elko County. Lamoille Canyon, Ruby Mountains, possibly named for a French-Canadian trapper who built a cabin there in the 1850s. Lamoille Canyon, the Ruby Mountains again. And this is a shot of the cover of the 2020 Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology, Nevada Geology Calendar. And this photograph taken by Terry Garside is a photograph of the mountain, and it is called Old Man of the Mountains. And you can see there's the profile of the face of an old man in that mountain peak. Elevation 10,551 feet. And this is a photograph by Ken Krahalik. Liberty Lake in the Ruby Mountains. And a photograph of Overland Lake by Chip Caroon. And here's some lichen on rocks. And here's Dolly Varden Mountains, the popular literature again. Charles Dickens, 1841 novel, Barnaby Rudge. In this novel, Dolly Varden was a flirtatious young woman fond of brightly colored dresses. In the streams here, the brightly colored Dolly Varden trout exist, a name also referring to the Dickens character. This is one of our whimsical names. And in fact, you look it up and do a little research on it. It's not the less pleasant meaning. It actually means there was a citation given maybe by a prospector that he actually tripped and fell, meaning he jammed his toe and fell down and hurt his toe. Wild Horse Reservoir area, and a photo by Chip Caroon of Emerald Lake in the Jarbidge Wilderness. And this is this is a name that is butchered the most in Nevada. It is not Jarbidge, it is Jarbidge, and it is a Native American derived name, and it is pronounced something like Jahawitz in Shoshone, but it's been anglicized to make it simpler to say into Jarbidge, and it was the translated meaning is the man-eating monster that lived in those mountains. And so to me, this is direct proof that Bigfoot definitely lived in Nevada, or still does, in the Jarbidge Wilderness, because Jarbidge means man-eating monster. Of course, it could be referring to bears or mountain lions, but I like to think about Bigfoot because that's just more fun. And so Douglas County commemorates Stephen Arnold Douglas, chairman of the Committee on Territories. The county was created in 1861, 3 years before statehood. And here's the Holden Barn. This is a geologic photograph. We had a tremendous, probably flash flood or glacial event that brought this huge rock down off the mountain. And now the rock stands out here all alone in the field. And so we could call that a flash flood or glacial erratic. And so I love the combination of the glacial or the geologic event in the old barn in this photograph. And a barn owl. And the Bake House, one of our early houses in Genoa, Carpenter Gothic style, built 1872. Carson City County, and this is a commemorative name for John Fremont's exploration teammate, Kit Carson. And I included this photograph of Carson City from the geology perspective again, because of the dramatic range front that is illustrated. And I'm speaking of this range front coming down here to the edge of the city. And so we have very active earthquake zones through these areas: Carson Valley, Eagle Valley, Trekking Meadows. And I chose this photo for that reason, just to remind us that we are in earthquake country. And then I liked the barn at the Lampa Ranch here at Carson City. And then I move on to White Pine County, and that gets its name from the native pine trees at high elevations. And the White Pine Range, current mountain elevation 11,513 feet. And this is sort of a naming erratic in that the range is called White Pine Range, but instead of called Current Peak, it's called Current Mountain. So the tallest peak in White Pine Range is actually called Current Mountain. And that's just the way it goes. Nothing is consistent, but that makes it more fun, right, Christine? Oh, okay. So here we go. Christine, tell us about Doso.
Well, Doso Doyabe was a peak that existed and has lived under a former Western name applied to it up until 2019, where it was known formerly as Jefferson Davis Peak, and it's in the Great Basin National Park. And this again is included in our exhibit and falls under the category of controversial names. And of course, most of you will know that there is a reason to consider names across the landscape that have been applied in the past that have pejorative terms or otherwise offensive names. But this particular one came about in kind of an odd odd way from a source outside Nevada that was questioning the name. And there was a lot of research with this too. This went on for 2 years, from 2017 to 2019. And what was interesting about this is all the research that kind of peeled away in layers. And the first thing that the board always wants to do with any site, whether it's a new name or a name change or anything, is to go to the research. And every agency on the board functions in a way that they have access to different materials, which is why a board exists. And so scouring through old maps or records or journals or whatever the agencies and the representatives have access to bring back to the group to review. Again, this took many meetings and the course of 2 years, and dialogue with all kinds of different groups of people, including 6 tribes that surround that space out there in the Great Basin National Park. And some of the interesting things that to be considered historically is we found reference to this peak dating back to 1859, and that goes before statehood. So you start thinking about like, wow, well, who named this mountain? Where did Jefferson Davis Peak come from? And of course, he comes to be associated with a controversial topic with the Civil War, having been the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War years. But this name appears prior to the Civil War, when Davis was, in fact, the Secretary of War for the whole of the United States. So this predates the Civil War times. It also predates Nevada statehood, and it was prior to the movement of the line of the Utah Territory into the state of Nevada. And so actually at one point this was part of the Utah Territory. So there was interesting things that came about with the research to think about, well, how did this name come to be applied on the land? It's also a really, really good example of the variety of names that can exist across a landscape and that do get named by people who are moving through. And, you know, at a time where Jefferson Davis was not associated with the Civil War, but came to be associated with the Civil War, and that's where his legacy landed, it came to be an issue, you know, 150 years later. And in 2017 was brought up as a suggestion for a name change. And this is where I like to really point out the difference between a name change and a name restoration. And I like that you have that here in your caption, Jack, that the name was restored after a lot of work and dialogue and communications with the tribes to the name that was listed as time in memoriam for the Duckwater Shoshone tribe, which was Doso Doyabi, and it means white peak or white mountain. And you can see here why. It's covered in white. It receives a lot of snow. It is part of the Great Basin National Park. And the people in the state of Nevada, if the name was going to be changed at all, there was great support for the idea that it would be restored to a name of the people who predate historic times. And we wholly supported the Shoshone application to restore the name to Doso Doyabi. And that happened in 2019.
Oh, that's brilliant. Great job of describing that, Christine. And so for everybody, just to clarify, follow the white arrow. So we are in Great Basin National Park, and this is Stella Lake. And then right up here, the left tall peak is Doso Doyabi. And I'll restore that white arrow. It ran away from me, and I can't find it now. Well, the left peak is Doso Doyabi, and the right tall peak, here's the arrow back. The white arrow right now is showing you Wheeler Peak. That is Wheeler Peak. And this over here is Doso Doyabi. And so beautiful job of describing that, Christine.
Can I add one more thing that's maybe
Sure.
interesting or noteworthy? It's also, I believe, the first site named or restored in Nevada that doesn't have a descriptor with it because it's embedded in the native language. So it goes to your previous example where
Like Powich Peak.
We don't want to say Doso Doyabi Peak because it would be White Peak Peak, and we want to avoid those.
So very good name. And it's parallel in time with the renaming of Denali, yeah. And so McKinley became Denali, and in similar fashion, Jeff Davis became Doso Doyabe. And Doso Doyabe has a very poetic sound to it too, like Denali. And so it's kind of a nice name. It's a very nice name. Okay, so here's a view photographed by Jim Faulds of the Snake Range from Wheeler Peak, 13,063 feet above sea level here in Great Basin National Park. And the Lehman Caves, photographed by Matt Richardson. Here are the Great Cliffs, Great Basin National Park. And Mount Moriah, named after the Palestine hill on which Solomon's Temple was built. Lincoln County commemorates Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, we're almost done here. If anybody's getting antsy, we're getting there. We're rounding third base. We're about halfway home. Cathedral Gorge State Park, Lincoln County, a photograph by Angel LaConfora. And pyroclastic volcanic fall tuffs near Hyco. Hyco is a Shoshone name meaning white man or white man city. And a photograph by Cheryl Glotfelty. And George Washington rock. So you can see George Washington's profile here as if he was lying down on his back, looking up. And a photograph by Jennifer Volchin. Clark County commemorates William A. Clark, who built the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad in 1901 to 1916, which ran through Las Vegas. And I have some photographs here, Lake Mead Recreational Area by Angel LaConfora. And I have Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area here by Matt Richardson. Valley State Fire Park here, Valley State Fire Park, and beautiful sandstone. And I captured that crow flying by, and it was just one of those lucky shots. And the contrast there was just amazing to me. So here are some petroglyphs at Valley Fire State Park. Here is one of our naming projects, and we're going to almost close this entire presentation with this. This is the Colorado River right below the big dam, and the local authorities and recreational authorities and had contacted us and said we would like to name some points along the Colorado River in the Black Canyon because there is a lot of recreation that occurs in this canyon. There are a lot of the people that float down in the river rafts, and I'll show you an illustration. Here we go. Here's river rafts, rafting on the river. And so they will have emergency situations where a person gets injured. They need to helicopter in and rescue an individual who has been injured. And they need a more defined naming system along the river so that they can radio in to the proper authorities and say, we have an injured person at such and such location. And so we had this initiative given to us, to the board, to name actually several locations along the Black Canyon here. And in this, I give an example, and in this photograph, I show you a photograph that I took here of Narrows Spring. And so we officially named this spot Narrows Spring, and there were several others given that became official record and officially named along this route for search and rescue so that they could pinpoint a location and find an injured person. So this was a very important naming project in that regard, in showing that names and knowing where a place is and what its name is, and that official name will help locate search and rescue and other authorities and help save lives, literally. And so here we are on the canyon, and our board, and it was not done at taxpayers' expense. It was out of our own pocket, but our entire state board went down there and we floated down the Colorado River, and I took a bunch of pictures, and we all did, and we saw these sites, and then we voted and approved it, and it was also approved by the U.S. board in 2012. And that does bring me to the end, and I just want to plug, please leave no trace, and that is the end, or the ends of the presentation. And Christine.
Well, I will also want to build off what you just finished with, which is something that people probably don't know. And I did mention you're getting some thank you Jacks in the chat. Thank you. And we are all clapping for you.
Thank you, by the way. Thank you.
The Nevada State Board is one of many boards, but of particular importance to us here today that are joining in is the idea that it is an unfunded board. It doesn't cost the state one cent. It is it's legislatively mandated and has existed since 1985. But I think it's important to mention that when you said at your own expense, and that's truly just often the passion that we have for research in names and toponymy, and also the no choice component that we don't fund the board so as to keep it from hitting taxpayers. Nevada is one of the states in our country that has such a vast and changing landscape based on where you are. You have the desert, you have the peaks they're spanning more than 9,000, 11,000 feet, and we truly go from all ends of the spectrum across this landscape, and you capture that so well here. And thank you for sharing that with us.
That question has been asked many, many times, what was the Battle of Battle Mountain? And it's one of those where the history was lost. It's not really known if there was a skirmish between maybe Native Americans and early settlers, or if early settlers had a skirmish. It's kind of been lost, and so it's not defined well, put it that way.
Well, there's another question, and I might mispronounce this, so forgive me. It says, do you know the origin of Mote, M-O-T-E, on I-80?
Well, let me look that one up, but it's probably a railroad. Let me look up.
There's a lot of railroad references.
Yeah, there are a lot of railroad names as well, and I actually should have. The closest I got probably was Railroad Point, which is actually a geologic feature, but there were a lot of names given.
While you're looking up, I'll mention something fun regarding railroad is, of course, the city of Sparks is named for John Sparks, the governor of Nevada early on. And during the research for the Sister Cities exhibit, we came across the information that there is at least 15 other cities or towns or areas, neighborhoods in the world named Sparks. And most of those had reference to railroad origins. So people that were like railroad superintendents, things like this. And yet the railroad history that's associated with Sparks, it was just a fun irony that the name of the city of Sparks, which by the way, Sparks, Nevada is the largest Sparks in the world. It is connected to the governor and not railroad history. So kind of fun fact for Sparks while Jack was looking that up.
Yeah, and so Mote, I was able to reference it really quick. It is indeed a railroad siding station name. And so when the railroad was built, the Central Pacific Railroad in 1869 across Nevada, and finished in 1869, that is, they would have locations that were named along the railroad, and they were established as service locations where there were sidings. And so you think of a state as large as Nevada and the expanse, every 20 miles, say, they would have to have some kind of maintenance facility of some sort. And so they would have names for these areas. And it was also a way for the railroad engineers to give a location if they had a breakdown. And so it was a location system along the railroad system. And so Mote indeed is a railroad name. And unfortunately, there's no descriptor of where they got the name Mote, but it was a station at between Paiute and Valmy on the Winnemucca subdivision of the Southern Pacific Railroad. So Central Pacific Railroad became Southern Pacific Railroad. So the Southern Pacific Railroad had their system of identifying locations along the route. And by this descriptor, it would have been out there near Battle Mountain, actually near Valmy. And so that's all I've got at this moment.
Well, those are great questions and fun questions, and I am so happy everybody was able to join. If you have any other questions, email me. Again, I'm Christine Johnson at the Sparks Museum, and we are at info@sparksmuseum.org. And at this point, I just want to thank you one more time, Jack, for this amazing presentation. And it sure was a trip around this state that I'm sure everyone enjoyed on this cold and kind of blustery winter afternoon. So thank you
Well,
for
thank you, and I want to thank you again to the Sparks Heritage Museum.